All right, signing these divorce papers.
Just sign where indicated.
Done. That wasn't so bad.
There's more. She wants the house and full custody.
What? No, that's not possible.
Daniel Cole signed his name on the last page of the divorce papers, and he did it with a smile he did not even try to hide. The lawyer across the desk barely looked up. The pen made a small, final sound against the paper, the kind of sound most people would not even notice. But for Daniel, it was the sound of freedom. He believed, in that moment, that he was closing the door on a small life and opening the door on a much bigger one. He believed he was trading up. He had no idea that he was about to lose $50 billion. To understand how a quiet schoolteacher from a small town in Ohio ended up at the center of a $50 billion inheritance, and how the husband who walked out on her would spend the rest of his life trying to undo a decision he made in less than 30 seconds, we have to go back. We have to go back to the beginning, long before the divorce papers, long before the envelope, long before any of them knew what was coming. Sarah Bennett was born in a small house on the edge of a small town, the only child of a woman named Margaret Whitfield. From the outside, their life looked unremarkable in every way. Margaret worked, or said she worked, for a logistics company that required her to travel often, sometimes for a week at a time, sometimes longer. She would leave on a Sunday night with a single suitcase and return days later looking tired but composed, never offering much detail about where she had been or what she had done. As a child, Sarah did not question it. Children rarely question the shape of the only life they have ever known. It was simply how things were. Her mother traveled, her mother worked hard, and when her mother was home, she was warm, attentive, and present in a way that made the absences feel like a fair trade. It was only as Sarah grew older that small inconsistencies began to surface, the kind of details a child does not notice but an adult eventually cannot ignore. There was a locked drawer in her mother's bedroom that was never, under any circumstances, to be opened. There were phone calls that ended abruptly when Sarah walked into the room, her mother's voice shifting instantly from sharp and businesslike to soft and maternal. There were the rare moments, usually late at night, when Margaret would sit on the edge of Sarah's bed and say things that did not quite fit the life she claimed to live. Once, when Sarah was 16, her mother told her, without any context or explanation, "If anything ever happens to me, do not trust anyone who comes to you talking about money. Not at first. Not until you know exactly who they are and what they want." Sarah remembered laughing it off at the time, telling her mother she was being dramatic, that nobody was coming after their family for money because there was no money to come after. Margaret had only smiled, the kind of smile that holds something back, and changed the subject. There were other moments too, smaller ones, the kind that only means something in hindsight. A neighbor once mentioned, in passing, that she had seen a car with tinted windows and out-of-state plates parked outside their house for nearly an hour while Margaret was traveling, and that a man in a dark suit had simply sat in the driver's seat the entire time, not knocking, not leaving, just watching the house. When Sarah brought it up at dinner, her mother laughed it off as someone lost, someone waiting for a different address. There was also the matter of the safe deposit box Sarah found a key for when she was 12, tucked into the lining of an old coat in the hall closet, a key her mother took from her hands so quickly and so calmly that Sarah assumed, at the time, that she had imagined the sharpness in her mother's voice. There was the year Margaret missed Sarah's school recital, the only time she ever missed something that mattered, and came home 2 days later with a kind of exhaustion in her eyes that Sarah had never seen before and would never see again, an exhaustion that did not match the explanation she gave, which was simply that the trip had run long. Sarah filed all of it away the way children file away things they do not yet have the tools to understand, not as evidence of anything, just as the small, odd texture of a life that was, in every other way, ordinary. It was during her second year of teaching that Sarah met Daniel Cole. He was sharp, ambitious, charming in the specific way that climbers are charming, always reading the room, always calculating where the next opportunity might be hiding. He worked in finance, low on the ladder at first but determined to rise, and he was drawn to Sarah's steadiness, the way she seemed to want nothing from him except his time and his honesty. In the early years, their marriage had the warmth of two people who genuinely chose each other. They rented a small apartment, then bought a modest house, the kind with a kitchen too small for the dinner parties Daniel would later come to want, and a yard just big enough for the dog they never got around to adopting. Sarah taught second grade. Daniel worked late. Then later still, as he moved from one firm to the next, each move bringing a bigger title and a bigger salary and a wider gap between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. By the time Daniel landed his position at a major investment firm in the city, something in him had already begun to shift, slowly enough that Sarah did not notice it happening in real time. He started to speak about their life with a kind of embarrassment he never used to have. He stopped inviting colleagues over, claiming the house was not impressive enough. He began comparing Sarah, not out loud at first, but in the small, telling ways people compare the life they have to the life they think they deserve. He noticed the watches his coworkers wore. He noticed the vacations they posted online. He started arriving early to meetings just to overhear how senior partners talked about their second homes, their private clubs, the schools their children attended, and he began to feel, for the first time in his adult life, a sharp and specific shame about the modest two-bedroom house he came home to every night. He never said any of this to Sarah directly. Instead, it leaked out sideways, in offhand comments about other people's success, in long silences at dinner, in the way he would scroll through his phone instead of meeting her eyes when she talked about her school day. And most of all, he noticed Vanessa Caldwell, the woman who ran his division, a woman who wore her ambition the way other people wore perfume, unmistakable, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Vanessa had a way of walking into a room that made it clear the room now belonged to her. She remembered names, she remembered numbers, she remembered exactly which junior associates were worth investing time in, and somewhere in his second year on her team, Daniel realized she had started remembering him. She would stop by his desk with a question that did not need to be asked in person. She would invite him, specifically him, to client dinners that had nothing to do with his actual role. She made him feel, in a way his marriage no longer did, like he was being watched, evaluated, and found impressive. And for a man whose entire sense of self had become tangled up in ambition, that feeling was more intoxicating than anything Sarah could offer him from a small kitchen with a chipped countertop. Vanessa was everything Daniel had convinced himself he wanted. She was decisive, magnetic, and surrounded by the kind of wealth that made Daniel feel, for the first time in years, like he was standing next to something he could actually become. She did not have a modest kitchen or a teacher's salary. She had a corner office, a driver, and a name that opened doors before she even reached for the handle. Daniel began staying later at the office, not because the work demanded it, but because Vanessa did. What started as professional admiration slowly curdled into something else, something Daniel told himself was not yet a betrayal because nothing had technically happened. He was very good, in those years, at drawing lines just far enough away from the truth that he could still believe he had not crossed them. Sarah noticed the distance growing between them long before she understood what was causing it. Daniel came home later. He spoke to her in the clipped, efficient tone he used with people who did not matter to him professionally. He stopped asking about her day, stopped noticing when she was tired, stopped reaching for her hand in the car the way he used to without even thinking about it. Sarah, for her part, did what many people do when a marriage begins to erode. She told herself it was a phase. She told herself he was under pressure at work. She told herself that if she was patient enough, kind enough, steady enough, the man she married would eventually find his way back to her. She had no idea that while she was being patient, Daniel was already planning his exit. He had begun, quietly and methodically, the way he approached everything in his professional life, to prepare for a divorce. He consulted a lawyer on his lunch breaks, careful never to use the firm's email or phone for anything related to it. He started moving money in small, unremarkable amounts that would not draw attention, the kind of financial choreography a man learns when his job is built around understanding exactly how money moves and exactly how to make it disappear from view. He timed it all carefully, waiting for a moment when Sarah would be distracted enough not to notice, vulnerable enough not to fight back, and unprepared enough not to ask for what she might actually be entitled to. That moment arrived sooner than Daniel expected, though not for any reason he could have planned. Margaret Whitfield died suddenly, a heart condition no one knew she had, the kind of death that arrives without warning and leaves the people behind it scrambling to make sense of a life that ended mid-sentence. Sarah was devastated in the particular way an only child is devastated by the loss of a parent who was, in many ways, her entire definition of family. She took leave from teaching. She spent her days in a fog, sorting through her mother's modest belongings, organizing a funeral for a woman who, it turned out, had very few people show up to mourn her, a detail Sarah found strange at the time, but was too grief-stricken to examine closely. Daniel watched his wife disappear into her grief, and instead of stepping closer, he stepped back. He told himself she needed space. He told himself this was simply not the right time. What he meant, though he would never have said it out loud, was that her grief was inconvenient to his timeline. He had a plan, and that plan did not pause for funerals. He had already given notice on a small apartment near the office, already signed the lease using a different mailing address, so the paperwork would not cross paths with anything in the house. He had already begun quietly removing small, personal items from their home, a box of old photographs here, a few books there, careful never to take enough at once that Sarah might notice the shelves thinning. He told himself this was simply being practical, getting ahead of an outcome that was already decided, but some part of him understood, even then, that he was choosing the easiest possible moment to leave, a moment when the person he was leaving had no emotional capacity left to fight for herself. While Sarah sat in her mother's empty house at night, surrounded by boxes she could not bring herself to open, sorting through decades of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger, Daniel met with his lawyer one final time and finalized the paperwork that would end their marriage. He chose a moment when Sarah was too exhausted, too grief-stricken, too disoriented to push back, and he presented the divorce not as a conversation, but as a decision that had already been made. He slid the papers across their kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, the same table where Sarah had eaten breakfast every morning of her marriage, and he spoke in the calm, measured tone he used in client meetings, explaining that he had already had everything reviewed, that the terms were fair, that there was no need to involve another lawyer because he had made sure to keep things simple. Sarah, drained in every way a person can be drained, did not fight him. She signed where she was told to sign. She did not ask a lawyer to review anything. She simply wanted the pain to stop, and Daniel, whether he understood it or not, was counting on exactly that. What Daniel did not know, what he could not have known, was that while he was finalizing his exit from a marriage he had already mentally left months earlier, a law firm in another city was working just as urgently to reach Sarah Bennett. The firm represented the estate of a woman who had died using one identity while quietly building, under an entirely different legal structure, one of the largest private fortunes in the country. That woman was Margaret Whitfield, Sarah's mother. For decades, Margaret had operated two lives running parallel to each other, so carefully separated that even her own daughter never saw where the seams met. The woman who left on a Sunday night with a single suitcase was, in the world she disappeared into, something far closer to an empire builder, a founder, an investor whose name, under a different legal identity, sat behind some of the most significant private holdings in technology, real estate, and logistics in the country. She had built it slowly, deliberately, starting decades earlier with a single early investment that multiplied far beyond what anyone, including Margaret herself, could have predicted, and reinvesting nearly every dollar of profit back into new ventures rather than ever changing the way she lived. She drove an unremarkable car. She wore the same handful of plain, practical outfits year after year. She bought groceries at the same discount store every week. Nothing about her daily life ever hinted at the scale of what she had built, and that, the lawyers would later realize, was entirely the point. She had structured her empire almost entirely without anyone outside a tight circle of lawyers and advisors ever knowing the two women, the traveling logistics worker and the billionaire investor, were the same person. Why she hid it, even from Sarah, is a question the documents would only partially answer. What the estate lawyers would later piece together, through Margaret's private letters and the structure of the trust she had spent years building, was that she had seen, early in her own career, exactly what enormous wealth does to people, and exactly what it does to families who are not prepared for it. She had watched friends, partners, and even relatives be consumed by it, reshaped by it, made unrecognizable by it. One letter, written nearly 15 years before her death and kept in a sealed file with instructions that it only be opened after she was gone, described in plain, unflinching language, watching a close friend's adult son destroy his marriage, his health, and eventually his own life in the years after inheriting a fortune he had done nothing to build and was entirely unprepared to carry. Margaret wrote that she would rather her daughter never know the money existed than watch the same thing happen to her. She wanted, more than anything, for her daughter to grow up untouched by that particular kind of corruption. She wanted Sarah to become exactly who she became, a steady, hard-working woman who built her own life with her own hands, before the weight of an unimaginable fortune ever had the chance to bend her shape. But Margaret had not been careless. Buried within the trust documents was a clause she had written years earlier, long before Daniel Cole ever entered her daughter's life. A clause that would only become relevant under very specific circumstances. It stated that should Sarah, at the time of Margaret's death, be in the process of separating from a spouse, the full transfer of the estate would be delayed and structured in a way that ensured the spouse in question would have no claim to it whatsoever, regardless of timing. Margaret, it seemed, had written her trust with the same caution she carried into every relationship outside her daughter, a caution that, in the end, would prove to be exactly what protected Sarah from losing everything to a man who was already halfway out the door before he even knew what he was leaving behind. The estate lawyers had been trying to reach Sarah for nearly 2 weeks before the envelope finally landed on her kitchen counter. Earlier calls had gone unanswered, mistaken for the kind of scam attempts that flood phones every day, the too good to be true voicemails promising prizes and inheritances to people who have won nothing. Sarah had deleted 3 of them without listening past the first 10 seconds. The letter, when it finally arrived, sat on her counter for 3 days, leaning quietly against her mother's ceramic jar, while across town, Daniel Cole signed the final page of their divorce and walked out of the lawyer's office believing he had just made the smartest decision of his life. He had no idea that the woman he left sitting in a small kitchen, unopened envelope and all, was about to inherit $50 billion. He had no idea that the timing of his decision, the exact week he chose to finalize everything, would end up being the single most consequential miscalculation of his entire life. And he certainly had no idea that the woman he was already imagining a future with, the woman whose office, driver, and name had pulled him so completely away from his marriage, would react very differently once she learned exactly what he had walked away